Page 67. As explained further below, BPD misclassifies and fails to investigate complaints of racial slurs and racial bias, allowing a culture of bias against African Americans to persist. Several examples highlight the types of statements we found that exhibit bias towards African Americans. The city paid $95,000 in 2012 to settle a lawsuit brought by an 87-year-old African American grandmother who alleged that she was shoved against the wall after she refused to allow an officer to enter her basement to conduct a warrantless search. After shoving the woman to the floor, the officer allegedly stood over her and said, "Bitch, you ain't no better than any of the other old black bitches I have locked up." They should have shot his ass. In 2014, a middle-aged African-American man alleged that a sergeant in Southeast Baltimore stopped him near Patterson Park and strip searched him in public. When the man protested and said he would contact a lawyer, the sergeant allegedly told him, "Get your N-word ass out of here." BPD found the complaint not sustained without interviewing any of the involved parties. One Baltimore firefighter and an emergency medical technician told us that prior to a march led by a prominent African-American pastor in 2015, a BPD officer told the firefighters, "We're going marching and there's going to be a problem. What y'all should do is turn them hoses on them." In 2013, a white male BPD officer made a racially charged threat to an African-American teenager while booking the youth into Baltimore's juvenile facility on a failure to appear charge. The incident stemmed from an argument about George Zimmerman, who had been acquitted of murdering Trayvon Martin 4 days earlier. In response to the teenager referring to the officers present as Zimmermans, a white officer threatened the juvenile by referring to the outfit Martin wore at the time he was killed. "Put a hoodie on and come to my neighborhood. You will see." The officer also threatened the youth by stating, "If you come to my neighborhood, I'll throw you in the water and feed you to the crabs. I will then let the crabs get fat off you and then sell them to your family." When BPD investigated the incident, the officer admitted to talking about the crabs and throwing him in the river, but claimed to Internal Affairs investigator that he could not recall whether he made the remark about the hoodie. BPD sustained a complaint against the officer for misconduct and making an inappropriate comment, but the investigative file contains no record of discipline. The officer remains employed at BPD today. In a complaint from August 2011, an African-American man alleged that during a vehicle stop, an officer warned a second officer to be careful because the occupants of the car might do voodoo on you, an apparent reference to their heritage and accents. A second officer made monkey noises throughout the encounter. BPD closed the complaint without making an investigative finding. An African-American man told us that while out walking April 2015, officers stopped him, accused him of looting, and called him a low-life N-word. The use of racial slurs and other racially charged statements described above, as well as others we uncovered during our investigation, typically occurred while officers were conducting stops or searches of African Americans. This is consistent with the areas in which we found large statistical disparities in BPD's enforcement. BPD misclassifies complaints of racial bias and fails to investigate racial bias allegations. BPD fails to record complaints of racial bias or affirmatively misclassifies complaints to mask their racial components. BPD also fails to investigate allegations of biased enforcement. By not using its own procedures to deter and correct biased conduct, BPD exacerbates relationships with Baltimore's African American communities. Numerous individuals told us that BPD either refuses to accept complaints, even for egregious racially motivated misconduct, or did not take their complaints seriously. Many community members thus feel that BPD is biased against African Americans and does not respond to their concerns. BPD's defective procedures for recording and classifying complaints of racial bias. BPD's Internal Affairs database reflects only 5 complaints from 2010 to 2016 that BPD supervisors classified as alleging use of a racial slur or other racial bias. The absence of such records stems from at least 2 procedural deficiencies. As discussed above, BPD erect significant obstacles to filing complaints. And even when community members succeed in filing a complaint of racial bias according to BPD's requirements, supervisory officers almost universally misclassify those complaints to mask their racial elements. As a result, BPD does not investigate the frequent allegations of race-related misconduct made against its officers and has no mechanism to track such allegations to correct discriminatory policing where it occurs. Most notably, BPD supervisors affirmatively misclassify complaints of racial bias, precluding the department from investigating or tracking bias allegations. A commander at BPD's Internal Investigations Division told us BPD requires all complaints claiming officers used a racial epithet to be categorized as racial slur complaints. And BPD's disciplinary matrix makes it clear that conduct relating to a person's race is a serious offense that may result in termination. Yet in nearly every case in which an officer allegedly used a racial slur, BPD officials categorize that allegation merely as discourtesy or using inappropriate language. For the complaints in which our manual review found that BPD recorded allegations that officers used the word NIGG fill in the rest, supervisors failed to classify the complaint as a racial slur or other allegation of racial bias 98% of the time. Okay, folks, as I indicated before, it is suggested that you get the actual report if you want to read or hear every single word, because this thing is wordy and this is going to take me several videos of 5 each to try to complete this. So I'm not going to read it all. I'm just going to skip through to what I consider to be the pertinent points. BPD uses unreasonable force. Based on our review of nearly 1,000 BPD's own investigative files on its officers' uses of force, we find reasonable cause to believe that BPD officers use unreasonable force in violation of the Fourth Amendment and fail to make reasonable modifications necessary to avoid discrimination in violation of Title II of the Americans with Disabilities Act, contributing to the pattern or practice of conduct that violates the Constitution and federal law. BPD's unreasonable force is not limited to officers' use of any specific weapon. We found it throughout the use of force files we reviewed. The Fourth Amendment guarantees the right of the people to be secure in their persons, houses, papers, and effects against unreasonable searches and seizures. This protection from unreasonable seizures prohibits an officer from using excessive force when making a seizure. Determining whether the force used to effect a particular seizure is reasonable under the Fourth Amendment requires a careful balancing of the nature and quality of the intrusion on the individual's Fourth Amendment interest against the countervailing governmental interest at stake. The determination must be made while viewing the incident from the perspective of a reasonable officer on the scene rather than the 20/20 vision of hindsight. To determine whether force used by a law enforcement officer is reasonable, we look to 1, the severity of the crime at issue, and 2, the extent to which the suspect poses an immediate threat to the safety of the officer or others, and 3, whether the suspect is actively resisting arrest or attempting to evade arrest by flight. To properly consider the reasonableness of the force employed, we must view it in full context with an eye towards the proportionality of the force in light of all the circumstances. Officers using unnecessary, gratuitous, and disproportionate force to seize a secured, unarmed citizen do not act in an objectively reasonable manner. Our evaluation of BPD's use of force was informed by many sources, including 1, interviews with hundreds of individuals who have had encounters with officers or witnessed these encounters, 2, interviews of the department's officers, supervisors, and command staff, 3, an extensive review of nearly 1,000 of the department's reports and investigations of officers' use of force, 4, the department's policy and training materials, and 5, analysis by our expert police consultants. The nearly 1,000 force cases we reviewed included a random selected, statistically significant sample from all use of force incidents by BPD officers occurring between January 1st, 2010 and July 19, 2015. The sample of 814 cases was identified by our statistical experts from the universe of all 2,818 incidents of force, including both deadly force and less lethal force, identified by BPD. The sample size accounted for a number of factors, including the type of weapon used by officers and whether the force was used against people with mental health disabilities or in crisis. Because of their critical nature, we also attempted to review all uses of deadly force by BPD occurring from January 1st, 2010 through the duration of our investigation, and we reviewed what was provided to us through May 1st, 2016. However, though we identified for BPD on multiple occasions additional deadly force cases that we had not received, BPD was never able to find and produce a case file for all deadly force investigations from this time period. The department informed us that it is unable to locate the files for 20 firearm discharges from the time period that we requested. Because of this lack of documentation, we were unable to conclusively determine the number of deadly force incidents that occurred during the time period we reviewed. This failure is quite concerning. The department's inability to maintain the files for officer firearm discharges reflects a serious deficiency in the oversight of officers' use of deadly force. For a number of other shooting cases, BPD provided us with supplemental information nearly a year after we initially requested the complete files. In the end, we were able to review over 100 investigations of BPD's use of deadly force. We carefully reviewed each of the force files we were provided, both deadly force and less lethal force, to determine whether each use of force was justified under applicable legal standards. Our review of individual use of force reports and investigations informed our determination of whether a pattern or practice of excessive force exists within BPD. We note that in a number of cases of both deadly and less lethal force, the reports and reviews of force provided too little information about the circumstances surrounding the use of force to allow our team and experts to determine whether the force was reasonable. This is troubling because despite the lack of adequate information to determine whether these uses of force were reasonable, BPD supervisors still approved all but a handful of these uses of force. This systematic failure to provide adequate oversight of use of force requires correction, even given the significant number of cases in which we were unable to make a decision. However, we were nevertheless able to make determinations in a significant number of cases to conclude that there is a pattern or practice of excessive force at BPD. While reviewing BPD's force investigations, we noted a number of trends. First, in a significant number of cases, officers use aggressive tactics that escalate encounters and stifle public cooperation, leading to the use of physical force when it is not necessary to resolve an incident. Officers approach incidents involving mere quality of life violations in a confrontational manner and fail to use basic conflict resolution skills, creating conflict where it does not exist before, or where it did not exist before. BPD trains officers to be aggressive, incalculating and adversarial mindset in its recruits, and teaches them to, for example, point a weapon at unarmed and innocent civilians to control the scene. Tactics such as these unnecessarily escalate encounters, increase tensions, and lead to unnecessary force. Second, officers use excessive force against individuals with mental health disabilities or in crisis. When families in Baltimore confront a family member experiencing a mental health issue, they often call 911 to request an officer to safely escort their family member to a hospital for mental health evaluation and, if necessary, commitment. In too many of these calls, officers arrive at the homes of families knowing they are being called to assist with a mental health incident without a plan to account for the mental health issue. Because of the lack of planning and proper tactics, they end up in violent confrontations with individuals with mental health disabilities or in crisis and use force, sometimes deadly, against these vulnerable individuals. Third, officers use unreasonable force against juveniles. It is apparent that officers have not received guidance nor have been trained on well-established best practices for police interaction with juveniles that account for their developmental stage and prevent the unnecessary criminalization of overwhelmingly minority youth. The lack of policy and training for these interactions results in excessive force being used against youths. Finally, officers use unreasonable force against people who present little or no threat to them or others. One such group includes individuals who are already restrained and under officers' control. Another group is individuals who are fleeing away from officers. Officers in Baltimore engage in a high number of foot pursuits, a tactic with a number of attendant risks, including endangering officers and community members. Due to the risk inherent in foot pursuits, agencies must exercise careful oversight over foot pursuits and provide proper guidance and training on when it is appropriate to engage in foot pursuits and how to do so safely. BPD fails to do so in some cases. The people who officers pursue have not committed serious crimes and present no threat to officers or community members, but these pursuits end with BPD officers using significant force. Additionally, in some cases, when individuals flee in vehicles, officers use unreasonable force after any potential threat to them has subsided. The department's failure to provide officers with the necessary guidance skills and oversight to resolve incidents in a way that keeps them and community members safe underlies officers' constitutional violations. The department fails to provide proper policy guidance on how and when it is appropriate to use force. It also fails to properly train officers on how to operationalize its policies, and in some cases has improperly trained its officers by teaching incorrect legal standards or improper tactics that lead to officers' unreasonable force. Finally, the department fails to exercise proper oversight to address potentially unreasonable force and remedy bad tactics when they occur. These failures have led to the systematic use of unreasonable force that we observed in our investigation. Okay, I'm going to stop it there. I am getting tired, but I'm going to pick it up on page 77. So I just cleared another 18 page. You know what? I'm going to go further. Let's go. BPD's overly aggressive tactics unnecessarily escalate encounters and result in excessive force. BPD officers' aggressive tactics in their encounters with civilians and unnecessarily escalate situations and contribute to officers' systematic use of unreasonable force. Officers use aggressive tactics in encounters that begin consensually or in cases where officers stop individuals for low-level and highly discretionary violations such as loitering, as well as violations that officers charge based on civilian conduct during the encounter, such as failure to obey, resistance, or disorderly conduct, as discussed in Section 2A. In these encounters, officers issue commands without explanation rather than communicating respectfully, explaining the purpose for their approach and providing subjects with opportunity to voice their concerns. When subjects do not immediately comply with officers' commands, rather than attempt to problem solve or use conflict resolution skills, officers resort too quickly to physical force, even if individuals do not present a threat to them or others. Even where force is justified, officers frequently use a high level of force when only a low level of force is objectively reasonable. Officers use these tactics against individuals with mental health disabilities or in crisis who have committed no crime and also on juveniles. The force used by officers in these situations is often unnecessary and disproportional to the suspected violation, threat, and resistance posed by civilians. The problem posed by and thus the tactics to be employed against an unarmed, emotionally distraught individual who is creating a disturbance or resisting arrest are ordinarily different from those involved in law enforcement efforts to subdue an armed and dangerous criminal who has recently committed a serious offense. The reasonableness of the officer's actions in creating the dangerous situation is not relevant to the Fourth Amendment analysis. In addition to contributing to officers' unconstitutional conduct, these tactics greatly undermine BPD's efforts to repair its damaged relationship with some segments of Baltimore's community. All right, I'm going to stop it here. I'm at 19 minutes and 30 seconds. I will pick this up on page 78 of the next video.